Hi there, I'm Alex. I work for Pentest Partners in the UK. I lead up our aerospace research and client testing work, but I'll be talking to you about something completely different today, which is the privacy implications of the use of location in dating apps and in something called teledildonics, as seen through the lens of trying to disclose some pretty important privacy issues to various vendors. Just to say up front, there is no nudity, but we're discussing kind of adult themes. So your caution is advised if you're watching this with your kids or if you're out in public somewhere or your workspace isn't awesome or something. I'd also like to state at the start that the purpose of mine and my company's research is not to kink shame anyone. Online dating is the norm now, and users of these apps and devices deserve the same protection as someone using, for example, a banking application. As we see later, there are coordinated disclosures with other researchers in this space, and I'd urge you to reach out and get assistance if you found an issue, but you're not getting any joy from the vendors. So back in 2019, a colleague and I started to look at dating apps, and I call this view of my test phone at the time my screen of loneliness. We wanted to see if there are any common good or bad things about dating apps. And although just because an app is listed on my screen of loneliness, it doesn't necessarily indicate that we found anything specifically good or bad. It's just to show that, there are a lot of the time. Many of them are actually clones of each other, made by the same makers, just with different brandings and targeting different demographics. One of the things that we kind of really picked up on and was the use of, at the time anyway, the Facebook SDK, which was used for both metrics, but for sign-in as well, through the Facebook Account Kit SDK. This was a service where you could just provide a telephone number or an email address, and that did some magic behind the scenes to try and determine whether you were a real human being or not, and then allow you to sign into these services. Now, that service was removed by Facebook in 2020, but in Grindr's case, and this is a screenshot from some of its communication at the time, was we found that it was sending your exact location off to Braze, which is an ad platform. And that location is down to 6 decimal places. That's more than enough to identify an individual house even. So even if you posit that the dating app itself was secure, the fact that your location is being sent off to ad and metrics platforms might cause you issue if they were compromised. And we'll see a potential implication of locations being sent to advertisers later. Now, many of these dating apps work by giving you back a list of profiles in your neighborhood. And they usually order that set of profile names by distance, which is your location of your phone at that time. And I guess the idea is that you can see who is nearby. But most of these apps, they take the location from your phone and then turn that into a latitude and longitude, as we saw with Braze. And then they basically just supply that to an API endpoint, and the API then responds back with a bunch of profiles and often distances, often quite accurate distances back to each of those profiles. Now, what we can do is if we interact directly with that API and we spoof our location, we can get distances back to a given profile for each of our spoof locations. And if we do that 3 times, where the 3 circles overlap is where our target profile user is, not us, but an individual. And because we've seen with the level of accuracy that phones will respond with a location with, this will often give us, again, an individual house. Now, when I was testing triangulation, I found I could actually determine whether I was at different ends of my house, even though that's sort of GPS indoors. So the accuracy is really quite specific. Now, I can kind of hear you say, well, what are the risks of knowing a dating app profile's location? And some of our dating apps that we looked at the time have a sort of niche market in BDSM and fetishes. Now, even in the UK, doctors, nurses, and social workers have actually been dismissed from their employment for what they actually get up to in private. That's obviously completely wrong, but that has been held the case in the UK. And even in the US, you can definitely be dismissed for being gay or whatever in some states. So being outed as a user of these apps certainly carries some risk if you can unmask an individual. Now, really recently, this story appeared around a priest being outed as a Grindr user. There are some gaps in the story, but one of the suggestions anyway was that ad brokers are reselling people's location data, which is then being exploited by other websites and services downstream for more nefarious purposes. And as we saw earlier, Braze, at least at the time, was given your exact location by Grindr. So there is definitely a potential route from our use of apps to de-anonymization just by virtue of where we hang out and visit and work. I know it's a bit of a trope within cybersecurity, but nation-state risks to individuals using these apps in certain countries is literally a matter of life and death. So you can imagine that governments in these parts of the world would actually start to look at and exploit some of these vulnerabilities because they're horrible people. Then obviously, you have stalkers and exes, people who feel spurned and jilted for whatever reason. And these apps can be used to, find where people live or, track someone in near real time. There's definitely be a fair number of incidents where criminals have used Grindr to rob people. At this point, there's no evidence that using these exploits to locate someone has been used. It's more that they have found their victims on Grindr and other similar services to arrange a meeting and then ambush them at that meeting. But you could definitely see that, if you had been in someone's home and you had seen there was something of high value in that home, you could use dating apps to work out whether they were away in a different country or something like that. So, protecting people's location is definitely something really important that dating services need to embrace for a multitude of reasons. Now, back at DEF CON 27 in 2019, myself and my colleague had written a tool and we demoed it, and that exploited the triangulation issues in Grindr, Recon, Gay Romeo, and another app called 3Fun. And we presented this into a single map view that worked in near real time. And because of the number of users of these apps, it was basically the location of 10 million people, which is quite terrifying. This is a view of central London and the UK at the time of our research back in 2019. Each app is color-coded different colors. So Grindr is yellow, Recon is red, for example. And this is just a screenshot that we took at the time, but you could zoom in and out. You can click on an individual map pin and find out everything about that user, their pictures, all that kind of stuff. It was really, really scary. We actually destroyed all of our data and our code shortly after we went public, and some of the app vendors fixed their vulnerabilities. We could literally track individual users as they went around their days from home to work to the gym, who they were meeting even. And with additional information like their profile pictures, people even included social media links to Instagram. The apps often gave you birthdays, and it really wouldn't have been difficult to completely de-anonymize someone or even a lot of people in bulk. Now, moving on to disclosures, the first app that we contacted was Gay Romeo, and it's still common with many sites and apps even today that there was no explicit mention about security on their website or their FAQs. So we ended up having to go to their sort of central support team, who perhaps are not necessarily briefed or expecting disclosures of security issues. They did respond, and they pointed us at an FAQ on their website, which talks about how to mask your position. And it is absolutely true. Within the app, you can actually choose a position of your choosing. So you're not necessarily visible at home or work, for example. However, that option is buried. It's not default. And because it's not default, your exact location is leaked at least once. So if you're going to use Go Romeo, I guess open it up first away from where you are. They said they wouldn't fix this triangulation issue because partly that would cause them work, because people wouldn't be reported where they thought they would be, which I thought was a pretty poor response. Recon were great. They handled these issues really well throughout. They came up and implemented a solution that we spoke with us between us. And basically they have a sort of a snap to grid style solution. So your actual location is moved to sort of a more granular, less granular grid. And they are no longer ingesting locations to so many decimal places. Most of the clients attacks that we've looked at so far are all kind of client-facing and APIs being used in the way that they were intended. But if the server actually stores that precise location anyway, then you've both got the threat of the server being exploited, or for a malicious insider to still extract all of those locations. So, but kudos to Recon, they handle these issues really, really well. Grindr were pretty poor, complete radio silence. They didn't respond to our disclosure. To be fair, this is probably the second or third time that they've been told by different researchers, as it turns out, about these issues. So yeah, it's maybe not surprising that they're not treating it as a new issue, but we felt with the ease of what we could demonstrate that maybe they would take notice. To be fair to them, they do redact location in countries with poor human rights records, like in the Middle East. So that is at least a good thing. They do say, again, you can kind of hide your location, but you can actually infer distance due to the ordering position in a list. So it's still a bit of a problem. And again, it's a non-default buried option. We did eventually get blocked for making a lot of API requests until we paid for Grindr Extra, then everything was fine again. And then they did end up blocking our company IP address ranges. So they obviously kind of knew we were there, but chose not to respond. Now, 3Fun was an absolute dumpster fire of an app. They were quicker replying, to be fair to them, but the underlying app was really, really, really bad. So this is an extract of some of the data that is returned. With 3Fun, we don't even need to use this triangulation trick because their APIs just return the exact location of another user. And then the app does the computation to work out the distance on the client side. If you chose to hide your location, which was an option, all that did was set a flag in the API, which meant the client app on your phone would just hide the distance. The distance was still returned in every single response, even if you chose not to hide it. So it gave us quite a lot of information, as well as people's full dates of birth and URLs to photos that were meant to be kept private. So often in dating apps, you have public photos that maybe are redacted, don't show your face, and then when you end up chatting with someone, then you can share more private pictures of your face or whatever, which is sensible. But in this case, returning the URL to someone's private pictures in the API was not ideal, because what it ended up doing was giving people's faces or genitals or both. We've obviously pixelated here, but given location, a picture, date of birth, that all of this is plenty enough to de-anonymize someone. They weren't great in responding, although they were quick. They didn't inspire confidence in being able to remediate the issues. Worst of all, if you want to delete your account and your data, they actually end up holding onto it for 6 months. So that's definitely not great. So 3Fun were, given the nature of the platform and their users, were not a great response. So this brings us up a bit more to date, which is some research we disclosed late last year, which is the Cellmate. And the Cellmate is a Bluetooth chastity gauge, which has a companion mobile application. So bluntly, you can lock up someone's check. The idea is that you can give control over the locking and unlocking to someone remotely. And this has definitely seen an increase in popularity with the global pandemic, not being able to see people and such. And the idea is a positive one. There have been many teledildonics apps over the years, like the Lovense Hush, for example. And being able to stay connected and play with your partner, even when you're apart, is definitely a really important innovation now more than ever. But what I really quickly found with the Cellmate mobile app is it had no authentication of any kind. And it suffered from an account enumeration issue because users were, as we'll see, were identified only by a 6-digit number. With that number, you could retrieve people's passwords, their exact location, all their private messages, and kind of interestingly, you could lock people in or out of their devices. Now, some might see that as a feature, but I definitely think you still need to have opt-in consent for that kind of behavior, and that was the point of the app after all. Disclosure was really very difficult, and the maker eventually ignored pretty much all of our communications, and we really struggled with the ethics of what to do. The vulnerability was so trivial to find, but at the same time, if we went public, then it might be quickly exploited. So we decided to kind of sit on it. Then we were contacted by 2 other researchers who'd independently found the same problem. And we ended up giving the vendor an ultimatum and then issuing a heavily redacted blog post. And it gained quite a lot of press attention. A few days later, the vendor did fix the issues, but by this point, people were receiving messages asking for ransoms, although it wasn't really clear whether the vendor had been breached or not. They were terribly uncommunicative, ended up posting poorly worded press releases, then redacting them, just terrible customer services all around. They've since launched a kind of really stripped down app without many of the original social features. Well, let's dive into this a little bit more and see where the problem was. So the exploit was trivial. This is pretty much the request. You can see that there is no authentication header of any kind. There's no cookies, there's no bearer token, there's nothing. So what you can do is you can search for this 6-digit incrementing number, and that returns a huge wealth of personal and sensitive information. This isn't all of it, but phone numbers, locations, birthdays, lots more. All these are completely unauthenticated, but inexplicably, this request returns a user's plain text password in the same response. So if people have reused that password, which people do, with that email address or that phone number, it's easy to pivot into other services. So once we have searched and found a user, subsequent requests use a longer and more complex number, this member code, It's kind of loosely based around the date that you joined, so it definitely could be brute forced as well. But the 6-digit short number returns this longer member code anyway, so it's not really a major hindrance. So once we have this longer code, we can make this request, for example, which gives us all of the Cellmate lock devices associated to that user. We can also then find out, again, using that member code and devices associated with them, what permissions someone has over that device. And part of the app was that there was a social area message board kind of thing. So whereas of the physical device could find virtual key holders and then give up control to them, or maybe they could set a certain duration and that they wanted to remain locked and so forth. And this was an interesting actual revenue stream for some people to provide this virtual key holding service. Now, if a user had control over their own device, maybe they're just playing it with themselves, all we have to do is make this request. Again, completely unauthenticated. All it needs is the longer code, which we can find easily, and the device, again, found really easily. And we just make this request and we can switch it so that user can no longer unlock their device. And this is what you would see next time you logged into your app to unlock your device. You would be greeted with this heart-stopping error that someone has changed permissions and you're no longer allowed to unlock your device. I think it would be quite terrifying to see that. The hardware itself was a little Bluetooth device with a battery that connects to this mobile app, as most sort of consumer IoT is these days. And if we explored the Bluetooth characteristics with Frida, and if we decompiled the app, it showed us something really interesting in these Bluetooth characteristics and the way that it obtains an unlock code from the servers. And actually, this device is pretty much identical to the note lock. This is a traditional padlock that we at Pentest Partners have looked at before. And each padlock has an unlock key, an encryption key, basically, which is stored server-side. So unfortunately, there is no way to create your own app to issue a magic unlock code or anything. You have to interact with the vendor's servers to get this unlock code. You can read a bit more about NoteLock and TapLock on our blog if you're interested. But it is effectively the same hardware and same behavior under the hood, just kind of in a different package. And that's true for a lot of these IoT padlock devices. They're all kind of very reference Nordic semiconductor designs under the hood. I don't really want to go through the whole disclosure timeline. You're welcome to pause and read it at your leisure. They did respond to us quite quickly initially, but after the initial disclosure, they just stopped responding. And we were in this huge dilemma, catch-22. If we simply let our standard 90 days elapse and publish, and they haven't fixed it, then bad people will probably find and exploit the vulnerabilities eventually. As we might normally do, which is demand a vendor take down the vulnerable APIs whilst they fix them, and then issue new mobile applications, then people will be stuck locked in their devices anyway. Remember that they need the mobile app and they need the servers to be able to get that unlock code to get out. Or if they do issue a new version, if people don't update their mobile app in time, or maybe something happens during the upgrade process and their details are lost, then potentially they're locked in. We tried lots of different avenues to try and get a response, from using journalists, contacting retailers and escalating it through wholesalers, but they just didn't respond. We basically resigned ourselves to not disclosing it, as that was the least bad option that we felt at the time. If we've done everything we possibly can at this stage, we've told them, okay, let's not make it easy for people to find the vulnerability by talking about it, but something will probably be found in the future, but we've at least done our part. But towards the end of the year, basically in September, October last year, we were actually contacted by 2 other researchers who had found the same issues completely independently. And at that point, we knew we really had little choice now, but to disclose in a coordinated way. This was the tipping point for us, because we thought the secret is out there. Bad people are going to find this sooner rather than later now, if 2 other people have completely stumbled across this. And the better option was to issue a joint statement from all 3 researchers, and to tell the vendor they've got one last chance. Otherwise we're going to have to go public, so that people can start to take steps to protect themselves. Unfortunately, they were too slow, and we published, and within a couple of days, people started receiving these kinds of messages in the apps, basically ransomware. Although they had issued new applications and APIs, which is good, they had left the old ones up behind the scenes. They were found, I guess, by people finding old versions of the Android APK, and people started to get demands for money, for ransom. That amount of Bitcoin at the time was about $1,000. It's a crazy amount. The vendor finally took action. They took down the whole service. They failed open all devices. They even rolled everything back several days in time at one stage. Their responses were definitely not great. Users were really left in the dark as to the extent people didn't know what personal information had been stolen, and possibly still don't. Was this just someone chancing their arm? Was it a real ransomware attack? It was definitely not ideal. We had mentioned in our blog post a way to get out of the device if you had to. And because this is kind of right next to really sensitive parts, we felt that advising people to use knives or saws or bolt cutters or things like that was definitely not ideal. So I'd found a way to what is called spike the motor. And the unlocking mechanism is just a bar held in by a solenoid. And if you just applied 5 volts to the white and the yellow wire, this would be enough to kind of blip the motor, release the locking pin, and you're out. So this was the way that we kind of suggested was an option. People could probably find the right numbers of batteries and some wires to kind of cobble it together. And we felt it was the safest way that people could extricate themselves if they were kind of stuck in. The vendor themselves then started to downplay the whole thing and issued a really weird video where they showed how to break out of the device by kind of just levering it with a screwdriver. There's actually like a really very tiny screw just holding the 2 halves together. So with enough force, the whole thing will shear and come apart. To me, though, it did seem a bit worrying, again, to use something sharp and pointy, and also, whether you could actually get the angle to do this when you're wearing it. It seemed a bit of an odd one to post. The vendor also kind of spun this ease of being able to escape as being a positive compared to like a traditional metal padlock, which I guess might rust shut, I suppose. But you kind of expect for the cost of these devices, which is $150 at the time, that it should be kind of inescapable. Isn't that the point? But more to the point, why is the vendor telling you to effectively destroy the device to get out of it? I would just say that, you know, traditional locks, padlocks, etc., don't kind of suffer the problem of being able to lock all of them remotely simultaneously. Yes, you might get one rush shut, but not every single padlock in the world. In January this year, the researchers of VX Underground were actually sent the source code involved in this attack and published it. So it was really interesting to see the code, and the vulnerable endpoints were pretty much as we'd found. So yeah, just definitely a really new one on me, you know, which is chastity cage ransomware. Amazing. I don't know whether this was legitimate or just for fun by someone, but interesting nonetheless. It was a really big story at the time. TechCrunch ran it, as did the BBC, and even John Oliver, which is kind of weird to see. But yeah, it was a major story, and you may well have come across it. They did eventually get their stuff together. I mean, it was one of the most difficult vulnerabilities we've ever had to juggle, I would say, personally anyway. It had got to the point where we had pretty much decided not to go public because that was the least worst course of action. But once we knew that other people were found it, that was it. That swung the decision, and coordinated disclosure was the better option. Now, their distributor sent us a pen test report earlier this year, and they claim the issues are now fixed. So yeah, your miles may vary, but I'd really love to hear your thoughts on this moral dilemma. I don't say that we've addressed it or dealt with it properly, but you know, I really struggle to wonder what else I could do. So I would really love to hear your thoughts on the morality of how to behave. I just want to round up the last few slides with, you know, what developers and users of these apps can use. It's very well for you to say don't use them, and in hindsight, if you were a Cellmate user, that might have been true. But there is definitely an onus and a duty of care on developers to make sure their devices are secure, and people kind of should be able to trust that they are so. So if you are in the game of making dating apps or this kind of IoT, we found that location leakage is a really, really common problem in space, and it has the potential to really seriously affect many kinds of users. So add that to your threat modeling, speak to a wide spectrum and communities before releasing your product into the world about how location can be misused. Really, all app makers should be really clear about what they're collecting, what for, and how you might be able to opt out. You're giving them money most of the time for dating app services. The monetization is you giving them money. I don't think it's actually okay for people like Grindr to seek out extra monetization by selling off people's locations. I don't think that's okay. In this day and age, all companies doing business on the internet, particularly those handling sensitive data, need to have an easier way for researchers to report issues and just keep us updated with progress. We absolutely all understand stuff takes time to fix. And genuinely, we do want to keep things private until there is no longer a risk. Stuff takes time to fix. We get that. So if things are slipping, just let us know and we'll absolutely understand. And we just want a whole disclosure. And I think ultimately every business is probably going to have a breach at some point in their lives, and it's how you handle that and communicate it that sets you apart from everyone else and will instill confidence in your users and keep them around even post-breach. Now, if you're a user of these applications, what can you do to kind of help protect yourselves and some more kind of general privacy, I suppose? I think the biggest one is that since iOS 14 and Android 12, these operating systems can only expose a approximate location to applications. So even if you're using Grindr or Gay Romeo and they're not really doing a proper job at redacting your location in app, this is still a huge improvement. I'd probably go further and say, don't actually allow applications to use your precise location unless you need it. Something like mapping, if you're driving or walking somewhere, you kind of do need to know exactly where you are, not just approximately. But this is where you can go in the privacy settings of iOS, for example, slide the slider precise location to be off, and then you'll be kind of just in a general vicinity, and it won't be your home. Again, this stops leakage of your exact location to a lot of these advertising services and things like that. So I think that's definitely a good thing. Be really careful about providing and sharing personal information. Definitely, it's difficult, but try and have an alternate persona. Definitely don't use your work email or a government email. I've definitely seen that before. Use the throwaway on, like Apple have a hide my email feature now, which creates sort of a one-off proxy email per app that can actually hide things for you. That's really good. Try to avoid using your real name, your birth date, for example. Be careful about what kind of photos you upload if you're on a sensitive job. I know these are terrible things to think about, but try and threat model if someone were to obtain these in your own head. What would the damage be? And for some people, it's perfectly acceptable, but for others, less so. And of course, the usual stuff about password managers definitely applies here too. So that's really me wrapping up. Thanks for your time. If you want to reach out or read more, tweet at me, go and have a read of our blog. I should be on the Texas Cyber Discord after as well, and throughout, hopefully. So if you want to message me on there, please feel free to do so. Thanks.